Here we go. Now we're recording. I don't want to miss two stuff. Actually, I talked to Preston yesterday, and we're starting to have some really good conversation. He's like, "Well, I'm not recording anything." I know the feeling.
Right. Now you have to just record a pre-intro like Preston and say, welcome to whatever.
No pre. This is no fluff. This is totally raw. No intros. Hi, this is Paul. Nothing beyond that.
This is Paul Vanderklay in the raw. That would fit right in with Preston's podcast.
That would definitely be an audio-only podcast. Nobody wants to see that.
Yeah, that reminds me of your humor with Adam Friended's graphic from the other day. Or Benjamin Boyce's. Yeah. I mean, it's something else. The world. I don't know.
Well, anyway, this is Luke, and Luke and I have talked before, but we didn't publicize it. So we talked maybe about taping this and maybe posting it. We'll see how the conversation goes. Luke, I got to know Luke mostly via Twitter, and so and then we had a conversation once and back and forth tweets and DMs and all this kind of stuff. And Luke, how would you describe yourself?
Man, I actually had in the notes on my phone, I made it probably 5 or 6 years ago, a self-description. I don't even know if it would be accurate anymore. I'm one of those, I don't know, I've gone back and forth. And part of my kind of postmodern deconstruction, I was very, and still am partially anti-labels, because labels, anytime, I mean, you talk about this, anytime you submit anything to language, it reduces it. Yeah. What was that? Explain. You plane it down, And so in that sense, I don't like labels, particularly because most people are complex, confusing, but I by nature I don't know if you're familiar with the Enneagram at all. Have you heard of the Enneagram?
Yes.
So I'm an Enneagram 4, and I'm a specific, and they, in general, they're the least frequent number, and they're just stereotypically hard to categorize.
Okay. But you're still a 4.
Yeah. Which is a very 4 thing to say. For my friend, shout out to Amber, who will probably listen to this. She has been writing a lot about stay-at-home parenting, but she likes the term at-home parents because the baggage with that. But for simplicity's sake, I'll say I'm a stay-at-home dad. And that's because my wife is in a profession that we just decided we didn't want to go the daycare route. Yep. And so we had, when I started doing that, we had 2 kids, we added a 3rd, and it's just stayed that way for now. So I stay at home with them. I love philosophy and abstract thinking and theology. And so the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, your videos have always really resonated with me. I don't know, probably the best description is, I definitely call myself a Christian, but I'm a weird, eccentric one. So that's probably the briefest way to describe it.
Okay.
I sometimes say I'm a very European person who was born in rural western South Dakota. So, that's probably how I describe myself.
Okay. And what kind of things did you want to talk about today?
So, something I'd love to talk to you about, I have a number of things, and I'll see if I tend to go on a lot of rabbit trails because my mind's all over the place. My consciousness Congress, I got a lot of them going at once.
And a lot of factions, huh?
Yep. And I'm always talking about things that tend to be rather esoteric. Like the thing that I'm probably most passionate about is what I describe as rationalism, which I think is something that's ubiquitous in Western culture. And I can explain why I think that is historically, but I actually think a lot of what's going on with Jordan Peterson and you and this whole phenomenon is getting at that. It kind of explains my own personal story toward Christian Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodox tradition. But yet that's the kind of, I don't know. I think I've met, I don't even know if I've met anyone in the flesh that I can articulate to my thoughts that can understand what I'm talking about.
Okay.
So I would love to try to talk about that. I think in your last video, when you talk about your idea of the monarchical vision is helpful, I think, in articulating what I'm getting at. I think it's when one uses language or intellect or rationality as a monarchical vision, that is rationalism. That's a succinct way that I would describe it. It's kind of like, God, I don't know who said this, but the mind is a wonderful servant and a terrible master. That gets at it. It's something, I describe it as, it's kind of like the water that we swim in, or I've heard it said that the thing that's the hardest to get people to see is the thing that everyone has decided not to see.
That's cool.
I think in the West, since the Enlightenment and kind of through the technology of philosophical advancement, we were able to abstract things to a degree that Vervaeke, I think, actually talks about this in his conversation with Benjamin Boyce, and I've been meaning to re-listen to it, but I think he said it stemmed from Marx and Hegel, that was kind of the origin of ideology, the ability to, you could think of it in terms of like Charles Taylor of moving to the buffered self, where you could use ideas as a technology to kind of abstract yourself from the ideas, and then you use that as a means to control your world. And so I think it's hard to articulate, but I think it's easiest to see in its fruit, like when, this is the way I think about it. Jesus in John's gospel said, the Spirit moves where it will, and you see neither it's coming nor it's going, but you see,
right.
But you see where it's been. Yeah. And I think essentially that's like what the church fathers were talking about with God and his essence and energies. You can't ever see God in his essence. You see the energies. And I don't think you can ever see, in your last video, you kept talking about, I mean, this would probably get into Adam's whole conversation with Esther, and I have my own, I don't know. I don't think a conversation between Esther and I would ever go anywhere. I think we have, because I think we have fundamental different assumptions. It's kind of like, I actually spoke, and I don't think Julian would mind me saying this. You put Julian and I in contact, and we had a really he's such a, I love so much about his Christian tradition, and he's just a wonderful young man. But we were talking about that a lot of what we see rationality as, because he's trying to get at the same thing, is that it's like with Christian apologetics, or like it's when a Christian apologist debates an atheist. Well, both of them have a box for everything. Yeah. They're submitting everything to their intellectual monarchical vision. Well, that inherently inhibits you from seeing anything outside. It's circular, from anything outside of that frame that could speak into that frame and correct that frame. And Jordan Peterson talks about that in terms of like anything, the truth that is outside of the truth that you currently apprehend will only ever manifest to you in error. Mm-hmm. Like that's the only way it's ever going to show up. If your system keeps working, it will work. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't work when it gets into an error. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that gets into like the whole debate between, I've been trying to work this out with Preston too, but this gets into the whole debate between like deontological. Preston Sprinkle. Yeah. But that gets into the debate between like deontological and utilitarian ethics. And I really think of those things as almost like a Taoist balance, it's like because I would agree with like Nietzsche and the idea of perspectivalism, and you can't ever get out of the subjective. You can't. But that doesn't mean that we can't see a better way forward. And those things are always in tension with time, with the future and the past. Yeah. And so that's a lot to throw at you, but it's just that general idea. And I think I think this is what I was trying to talk about in our first conversation. and it didn't, and I couldn't. I feel like I'm getting better and better at articulating it, but it's still hard. But to me, this is what I see as the biggest problem in the West, and it's even in the Latin Church, I would say. Like I heard, I know we both love Bishop Barron. I mean, the little that I'm familiar with him, and his most recent Jordan Peterson video I watched the other day, and it was great. And I think they may be talking soon. Seems like they will be.
Getting Peterson nailed down can be difficult sometimes. But
but it was an interesting conversation, but then toward the end he answered one question at the end, and it was from this did you watch it?
Yep.
And it was from this Indian guy who's I think he's maybe British, or he's an immigrant. He's in Britain. And he asked a question of essentially utilitarian observing. It was like a utilitarian observation or a pragmatic observation of the morality of Hinduism versus Christianity.
Right.
And Bishop Barron's response was depressed me so much. It was I've loved so much of what he said, and I think the guy's brilliant, but he went into the very thing that I would like to see uprooted through the Jordan Peterson phenomenon. He fell right into it. He said, like, well, I would say ultimately, because it's true. And here's the thing is, like, I don't disagree with him. But what he means by that is it's true in a monarchical vision.
So I'll just summarize that little conversation. So this Indian basically said that when I talk to my Hindu friends, they say, why should I become a Christian when, Christian morality doesn't seem superior to Hindu morality? And Bishop Barron said, well, there's plenty of debates with that. And, you've got plenty of Hindu Muslim violence and Hindu Buddhist violence. And, just because Westerners don't know much of that history because they don't pay attention to anything but themselves Bishop Barron didn't say that. I'm saying.
Yeah, right.
So then Bishop Barron then said, well, you should tell your friends that they should believe in Christianity because it's true, not because it works. And so you had the truth versus pragmatism thing. But now Peterson also, of course, Peterson isn't one who shies away. Peterson will play that truth card often too.
Right.
And even as a pragmatist, so his pragmatism is within his truth claims.
Right.
He will also play that truth card too. But when Barron said that, and then you mentioned it, I thought, oh yeah, Luke is gonna react to this. This is not, and probably partly because of how you grew up and your background. And when you look at, say, the apologist game that Esther and others are big into, William Lane Craig, you and many people who follow Peterson look at that whole game and say it's a fruitless game. It doesn't, and when I say it's a fruitless game, I mean it doesn't produce the kind of fruit that I value. Maybe someone will win the debate. So one way to look at, say, the conversation that Adam and Esther had about objective morality was who won. And I played that card a little bit in my video.
Right.
I thought Adam did. In some ways, Adam won. That doesn't mean that I think Adam's positions are better than Esther's, but Adam presented himself. But we very quickly turn it into a binary, an on-off. And I think part of when I listen to you process this stuff, you've got some reactivity to some of these facile binaries, and when you hear them, it's like, you're suspicious of them.
Yeah, and it's not. I mean, I don't know. Like even in your whole, I'm still working through what I believe on. Like your idea of Platonism and Lewis and the Tao and the shadows. I mean, your whole last video. I don't know what I think about that. I tend to be I don't even know what the word is. Like as there's three options, I think, philosophically, of like the primary essence of the world, and it's like some form. It's either monism or some form of dualism or some form of like a potential third, immaterial, material, and how those things work. I don't know. I would tend to think that it's all, I don't know, like Rupert Sheldrake talks about this a little bit in like his, and I know you followed him some, but like with consciousness and is the sun conscious, and the whole idea that there are levels to consciousness. And so like material or the sun or a rock could be conscious. It's just a different kind of consciousness and a lower tier of evolution than our consciousness. And so I tend to think of like the abstraction, even when you're talking about math, like with abstraction, this is what I immediately thought of. And I haven't listened to all of Esther and Adam's conversation, but how Esther appealed to math as kind of an objective, outside, true thing. And I've had this conversation with Preston, actually, is that 2 + 2 is 4? Is that objectively true? Well, I'm reminded of when Peter said that sometimes abstractions can even be more real than the concrete thing. He said this, I think, in a Rubin report. But and I think he was referencing to it with Christian metaphysics anyhow, so that gets really complicated. But
well, and with fiction, he was using fiction. He was saying that in many ways fiction is an abstraction from real life. And the abstraction can be more true in that sense. Now
it plays at every level.
Right. And when Peterson says that, when he thinks through that, so this morning, I was thinking about my next video, and I might do it with some of that Bishop Barron video, and then he gets into Lessing's Ditch, and then he gets into, then I'm probably going to go to Paul Maxwell and N.T. Wright, and so, but this question of then Bultmann, what is mythology, and how do we connect with? So you've got this Bible. So I just finished this conversation with a guy whose video I'll post. I'm getting kind of a backlog of conversation videos, which is good because I'm going to be traveling next week, and that way I can kind of space them out. Yeah. But he was talking. A lot of people have come to curiosity and even identification with Christianity via Peterson, partly because they saw in the Bible, they saw in the treatment of the Bible this very narrow, well, here's Adam, and they're going to forefront the history that this really happened, because that's the big modernist fundamentalist fight. This really happened. And they want to keep saying that early and fast. Yeah. This really happened. This really happened. It's the most important thing about it is that really happened.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting though is that even in churches that forefront this really happened, when they actually treat the text pastorally, homiletically for their people,
right,
they treat it symbolically.
Right.
And it's that symbolic, sometimes mythology. See, myth and symbolism aren't exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
But mythology trades in symbolism.
Yeah.
But so if you listen, you can listen to the most fundamentalist preacher that will, God said it, the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it. The snake's lips, yeah. The snake had lips and they moved. Right. They get all the way down there, but when they actually try to apply the verse to people's lives, they have to go via symbolism in one route or another. Otherwise, that historical event stays disconnected from them back in time.
Yeah, it's an abstraction.
Right.
Right. And I would say the reason that is because the mythopoetic, the symbolic speaks to your elephant. I mean, it speaks to the greater part of you. So here's an idea I want to float at you that I think relates to this. Sorry, did I interrupt a flow?
No, keep going.
Okay.
I interrupted you.
Well, we'll just constantly interrupt each other.
I think we probably will. That's how people from New Jersey talk. So.
Okay. Well, my politeness is first percentile. So, I've been trying to think about this idea, and I don't. It's a little bit of a riff off of Peterson, he had a Patreon once where he talked about free will. Do you remember that? And he talked about it in relationship to time.
Yep.
And
That's a very interesting conversation.
he said, like, it seems to him that no one talks about this very much, that as a decision is further away from you, you have more freedom to it. But then as that approaches you in time, up into the moment of decision, it's determined. It's bound. At the moment of choice, it's over. Yeah. Like your elephant, your liturgy, your story, your circumstance, everything is trained. You cannot do otherwise at the moment of decision.
Yep.
And I almost think of that, like I talk to my kids about a choose your own adventure, like, cause I found all these choose your own adventure books at a garage sale, and I grew up with those. And so I talked to them about that, and this is why I love Peterson so much, that all of your decisions have gravity, because if you take a certain amount of steps up this road and not this road, it comes to a point where you can't get back to that road. And so that's what is meaningful, not what's expedient is. And so it seems to me, this is how I tie it to belief. It seems to me, now tell me if you disagree, that belief is determined. It's bound. It's a past thing. Whether or not you're consciously aware of what your beliefs are, that's a different subject. But what your beliefs truly are, how you act, how you live your life, they are determined. They are embodied.
I'd be a little squeamish about the word determined. I'd say they're not voluntary.
You're not free. You're not free in relation to your beliefs, because you're enacting them. They're embodied. They're already being lived out.
And we know your beliefs are not subject to your will. And it's a good thing.
Yes.
If our beliefs were subject to our will, we couldn't live.
Yes.
Because our ongoing navigating of this physical world requires that I actually believe I see the truck coming barreling down the street.
Right.
I don't believe that truck is there. You won't believe it very long.
Right. And so it seems, so this is my practical takeaway from that, is that, and I think Peterson has talked about this also, that language only deals in the future. It deals in potential. And what language is the logos. It's the meaningful thing that goes out and orders chaos. And so when we're interacting with someone, when we're talking, what we're doing is trying, in an abstracted way, we are using language to say, okay, in the future, this is how I see the world, this is how you see the world. And it's thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's that dialectic that we're having, where that's one way that God has provided as a grace for us to transcend our necessary and bound subjectivity, is we can hopefully integrate, the better that we become disciplined to that, someone else's experience through language, through the logos, and move forward into the future. However, if your beliefs aren't subject to your will and they're already embodied, when you talk to someone who has differing beliefs to you, you're only addressing the future. You're only talking about potential. So why would you be mad? How could you be mad about that? You're dealing in the future. It should be solely persuasive. Because, like, how can you? That's
a very rationalist imagination of how human beings are.
Well, that's because I don't think people believe it. This is my whole point. I think people are rational ideologues because I think they have ideological possession, and so I think what's happening is their fruit, the spirit that is within them is being betrayed through their anger. You don't see the spirit, you can't see the spirit, but you see its effects. So when you become angry, when you're talking to someone about belief, you're betraying that you are not submitted to logos, you are submitted to your ideology. You are being a rationalist. And I think
Christians got angry. It's not just about anger.
But I don't know.
So I'm studying Luke. Yeah. I'm studying the end of Luke 2 and the beginning of Luke 3 this week for my sermon. And it's very interesting because the Gospel of Mark, Matthew and Luke don't have it. So Jesus is in the synagogue and there's a man with a withered hand. And again, there are Pharisees in the synagogue, and Jesus looks at them and he knows what they're thinking because he's going to heal this man with a withered hand. And he gets angry with them. And Mark includes that, not Matthew or Luke. And then Jesus also in Mark, not Matthew and Luke, says, you people in your hard hearts
Yeah.
And so Jesus is angry at them and their hard hearts.
But he's angry. So I agree with you, but I think that he's angry with them not about their innocuous profession of belief. He's angry at them because of their idolatry and what that manifests in the world. So like one of my I think it's related to this. One of my favorite things, and even though I don't swim these circles anymore, but one of my favorite sections from a book is from back a while ago. Desiring God and John Piper did this conference called Think, and they had a book that came out of that, and there's a chapter on Jesus and the Pharisees, and I believe it's from, shoot, I'm gonna forget what it's from. It's from Luke, I think. I forget the passage, but it's essentially when the scribes come up to him and they say, on whose authority do you do these things? And
Right.
Jesus says, well, I'll ask you a question and then I'll tell you. And he said, the baptism of John, was that from God or from man? And then so then they go away. Then the narrators, they go away and they say, well, if we say it was from God, they'll say, why didn't you believe him? And they'll say, like, if we say from man, well, they'll stone us because they think he was a prophet. So they come back and they say, we don't know. And Jesus says, neither will I tell you. And I imagine Jesus was mad at that moment. But Jesus was mad for the same reason I get mad at ideologues, because and this is the title of this section is called Practical Relativism. And Jesus goes on to say, you see the sky and you know when to harvest and you can interpret all these things right. What John Piper, and I think this is brilliant exegesis, goes on to say is there's nothing wrong with your deduction. Your brain works fine. The problem is that you're not submitted to the truth outside of the truth that you want to be true. You're an ideologue.
Right.
You don't care if the baptism of John was from God.
Right.
You're not submitted to the truth.
Right.
You're too concerned with your own position and power and authority.
Right.
Your
And that's
monarchical
exactly
vision.
Peterson's point about lying pastors.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this is ultimately, this very thing, this conversation is ultimately why I ended up moving toward Orthodoxy. I got tired of trying to have this conversation and having it go nowhere because it's pervasive everywhere. I actually think, and I think it's the same spirit that's within militant new atheism. I think it's what Adam Friended doesn't like. It's within scientism. It's underneath most of Western culture.
I'm just trying to differentiate what you're identifying here from common corruption, because when it's really embedded in Peterson's rule: do what's meaningful and not what's expedient.
Yeah.
Now, what I've found is and it's in the video that you're watching. That's the video I did on meaning as Peterson's sacrament,
Right.
which you'll get to at the end of the video. Because, when I think of do what's right, not what's expedient, do what's true, not what's expedient, the thing that I pair expedient with is often right and true. And Peterson says meaningful. Now, the tricky thing about the meaning word, as was revealed in the Vervaeke Peterson talk, is that meaning is both an experience or almost a feeling. This feels meaningful.
Sure.
And Peterson, in the conversation with the Israeli that I get to at the end of the video that you're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
Peterson backs away from that and says meaning is real. And that's why, I think for Peterson, meaning is a sacrament. And what I mean by that is that meaning connects him to, in a sense, the forms. If you want to use a Platonic construction, the forms. Meaning connects him to that which is most real. Now, that, again, if you get into Peterson's ontology, that gets really complicated because of where some of the ways Peterson doesn't want to commit to a metaphysic, but
does he do that in Maps of Meaning?
What's that?
Does he get into more of his ontology in Maps of Meaning? I haven't read it yet. Not to derail you, but I'm curious about
see,
that.
the issue with Peterson's metaphysic continues to be expressed in his difficulty with the resurrection. Because if your metaphysic is settled as a secular humanist, it's very easy to say to Sam Harris, I'm with you, Sam. Most probably didn't happen. And Sam could bully Peterson into that in his conversations. That's what happened at the end of the first talk.
Right.
But then Peterson keeps backtracking. People keep asking him, and he's not ready to close the door on a physical resurrection. So what that means, and that's why I did that video about, so you've got the metaphysical level. You listen to Vervaeke. Vervaeke again and again signals, I'm a secular materialist who uses Buddhism as psychotechnology to give myself meaning within this worldview. So Vervaeke establishes himself in that worldview. Sam Harris establishes himself in that worldview. Bishop Barron establishes himself in a classical theistic worldview. Jordan Peterson is on the line. He keeps hopping back and forth over the line because different worldviews offer him different things. And that's why Jung is really important to him, because Jung keeps going back and forth over the line. And that's why in that video that you're watching, I do read from Jung's autobiography, because Jung doesn't have a problem with knowing that something's going to happen because he can feel it in his gut. In other words, for Jung, like Peterson, the world is stranger, and so Jung is going to leave room for the parapsychology and the occult. Whereas
those are my people.
There you go. So, but there is room for that. So that's why a classical theist approach is bigger than a secular humanist approach. Actually, secular humanism is therefore, in a sense, nested within the classical theist because it's derived from it. So anyway, so back again to the point, because when I talk to you, I'm always trying to figure out, okay, where's Luke's line? How can I, okay, he's a 4, he's not going to like to, I'm not going to put you in a box, but at least I want to have you have a representation of, I want to be able to know you enough so that I can mind read you enough so I can predict, if I hear something, where's Luke going to go with this? Okay. So your point about, this meaning versus expedience, and the Pharisees, the Pharisees not wanting to answer Jesus, not because, if they had any guts, they should say, no, Jesus, this is from man. This is you. I don't really believe that. And they don't believe that because they wouldn't put him to death. They wouldn't dare put him to death if they believed he was from God.
I don't know. Maybe. I think that's possible. This is where there are levels of deception and idolatry that are even worse. This is why, and whatever, you'll get to it eventually, but why I love C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy so much is it's better than the Abolition of Man. You talk about the Abolition of Man a lot, but this is why he wrote it, is because it gets at the elephant underneath the Abolition of Man. So the Abolition of Man will speak to your writer. The books will get the elephant.
Right. That's why I wrote Narnia too.
Yeah. And so there's different characters within the book. So 2 of the main characters are Divine and Weston. And I think it's in Perelandra, he characterizes the difference between the 2 and why one degree of fallenness, even though it has a certain look, is not as deceived and is not as evil and is not as bad as the other. And I tell you what, when I read, especially this time, these are the only books I've read multiple times. It was my 4th time through it. There's been a lot of personal development and evolution. my whole intellectual journey essentially started with the Abolition of Man. I read that probably 10 years ago. Probably had I need to reread it because I probably had no idea what I was reading. But anyhow, in Perelandra, he essentially, there's a lot of talk between this Weston character, the unman, and the lady, and the main character Ransom, and there are times within that book that, especially toward the end, where Weston is saying things, and it actually terrified me as somebody who's intellectually inclined and thinks that I can't always articulate myself well, but I think I understand my own thoughts relatively well. But it terrified me in reading through Weston's debates and things, because I said, I don't know that I'd know how to talk. I don't know that I'd know how to refute this guy. And a lot of what he's saying sounds really good and really close to things that I believe. And in that light, Lewis is probably doing a little bit of Dostoevsky, what Peterson talks about, like painting his characters in the best possible way. And it's hard to think through why this character is wrong about things and what's actually going on. And this is, and so I don't, what was my starting point with that? We were talking about Pharisees.
And corruption and belief.
Oh, and yeah, and deception and belief. And so I don't, even with the Pharisees, I think what you were saying is that they didn't believe that this was from God, or else they would have behaved differently. I don't know.
Well, that is a good point, because that level of, and that level of self-deception manifests, and that's where, in a sense, the pragmatic test of action breaks down. We do the pragmatic test of action is in a sense a test of knowing. How do I know what you really believe? It's by what you act. But you are internally conflicted too, which is why maybe your actions are a better guide than your words, but your actions will also be plotted on a chart, and I'll probably try and look for a trend line, because they too will be inconsistent. And you know that as a parent, because your children, are little legalists, and they are tracking you closely, because whether you're allowing them to watch TV or play computer or have ice cream in the afternoon, for you, that's just kind of, but for them, it's a big deal. Yeah. So, you deviate, they will call you on it. Yeah.
They're like, I have this rule book, which is my monarchical vision that I want to submit you to.
That's right.
Actually, don't you think that's what Jesus and Paul, like, you don't think that's what they're talking about in Galatians with law and being a pedagogue and a school teacher? Like, this is, so I would throw out this idea at you, in connection with that, and then see what you say to respond to it. One of the books that's most influenced me, and I've been meaning to reread it because I think I absorbed about 20% of it, was George MacDonald's Lilith. And I've talked to you about this book, but C.S. Lewis has just been so influential to me. And when he said, like, everything I've done is kind of a weak homage to MacDonald, I was like, why am I not reading George MacDonald? So I read his book Lilith, and this is probably why it's so influential to me, and why I relate to Peterson and Jung and everything, is that book is like a psychedelic dream trip. I mean, like, good luck keeping your orientation. I mean, it's a little Alice in Wonderland, a little Magician's Nephew, a little Dostoevsky philosophy, and just all intermingled in a weird way. And it's why I really like the idea of the dream. But in that book, so with, I derailed myself again. In that book with, what was I talking about? With belief. Shucks. Never mind.
No, Lilith. You were talking about Lilith and Lewis and Jung, and it's a dream.
Right. And I was going to throw this at you. So, belief. Shucks. Oh, an embodiment. So, yeah. So like little children. Got it. Found it. Found the thread. So,
Another George MacDonald.
right. Or Flannery O'Connor, right? He talks about the
Well,
thin
have you read The Princess and the Goblin to George MacDonald, to your
parts
kids?
of it. I haven't worked all my way through
Read
it.
it to your kids. They'll
Yeah.
love it. I read it to
Yeah.
my kids. They loved it when I was
Yeah.
homeschooling them. But anyway, go on. We're really bad for each other because we really do interrupt each other, and it's just one rabbit trail after another. But
Right. And my
anyway,
mind is
Lilith,
all, yeah.
children, Jung, Lewis.
So in Lilith, the kind of almost like the vision of what people should be are characterized by these people. They're called, what are they called? The little children or something? But there's essentially these people that are little people, but they're not. And the main character runs into them and thinks they're children, but he realizes they're not children. They're just small. But it's just, I think it's MacDonald's idea of kind of within a story encapsulating what Jesus says, like, let the children come to me and you must become like little children to enter the kingdom of heaven. And one of the ideas that I love from the Bible that I want to, there's these little really short sayings that really pop out to me. You say, why do you pay attention to what do you pay attention to? There's ones that just pop at me. Saliency for Vakey.
Yep.
One of them is wise as serpents, innocent as doves.
Yep.
I think about that a lot and what that means. And then in connection with Galatians and law and monarchical vision and what law is, what I think of, I'm picking it all back up.
Yep.
What I think of with all those things is that the law is there as a pedagogue. That's what Paul says. It's a school teacher. It keeps you in line. It's a heuristic, if you will, to keep you pointed to the good, true, and the beautiful.
Yep. Yep.
I think we tend to think of it in Platonic terms, but I think that's a modern eisegesis on the text, maybe. And then I think what wise as serpent, innocent as doves is that I think within Christianity, I would say, I think there's a calling not to transcend in a way that just completely disregards it, that then is like antithetical and like antinomian against the law, but I think you're supposed to surpass the law in a way that is no longer submitted to the law in itself. Like that's a law. I say it this way, like tricks are for kids, laws are for kids. Like if I'm having to tell my son when he's 20, don't hit your sister, I have failed as a parent. Like you don't want your son to not hit his sister when he's 20 because, oh yeah, Papa says don't hit your sister.
Right.
And I don't know with the legal kind of dualistic Platonic rationalist thinking that I'm talking about, I don't know that true virtue in lovers are even possible.
Yeah. It's so interesting. So I was listening to N.T. Wright this morning, going back through some of the Gifford lectures. And so I'm thinking about Boltzmann and Peterson, and then Karl Barth comes into the conversation. And then thinking about Nadia Bolz-Weber recently wrote a book on sexuality, and it's like, well, anything
ethically
between
sourced porn.
That's right. Anything between consenting adults, no animals, and no kids, no animals. Everything else, A-okay with God. And of course, she comes out of the Lutheran tradition, where one of the people sometimes say, what's the difference between the Lutheran and the Calvinist? Now, again, when it comes to application, contemporary 500 years after these guys, there's going to be a lot of fusion and mixture. But Calvin, of course, has the third use of the law, where the law is a guide for grateful living. In other words, the law informs us of God's mind and God's desires, within context, of course, and therefore it helps us express our gratitude for the deliverance that we've been graced with. And that's helpful because part of the difficulty we have with dealing with Galatians is, the Protestant Reformation deeply tries to address corruption in the Latin Church, and does so in just some limited areas of Europe. And that forces a reformation for the rest of the Latin Church. But you still, there's that doing that kind of surgery that late in the game is going to be messy, and the Protestant Reformation was messy. Now with you going all the way back, let's say to the Orthodox, and kind of the more it's interesting, because one of the things that you've talked about quite a bit too has been, I can't think of the labels you're using about the positive versus the negative.
Apophatic and cataphatic theology.
Right, the apophatic. There's something about that's right in terms of freedom, where it's ironic that it's in a tradition which is very prescriptive in terms of the liturgy. I mean, when you go to church on a given Sunday, 95% of what you're going to be doing, you'll know beforehand, and everyone else will know if they're attentive to the liturgy, because the liturgy dominates. And if you listen to Jonathan Peugeot, for example, he'll say, well, that's a really helpful thing, because you have clergy that's an idiot, and at least, unlike a Protestant church, you're not going to have at least 30% of the service dominated by the ramblings of that idiot, off the cuff or whatever. It's a surer container in some ways.
Yeah.
So there's an interesting contrast between the kind of the openness of the tradition that says we're going to elucidate what God isn't more than what God is, as opposed to the Latin. Mm-hmm. And really, Protestants are part of the Latin tradition. That's always important to remember, that they are Protestant Catholics. And that's where the Orthodox is such a strange new entry into the church scene in North America, because neither the Protestants nor the Catholics quite know what to do with them.
Yeah. I mean, that is, the Orthodox Church in America is an interesting phenomenon on a lot of levels that I don't, and I've gone into it fairly wide-eyed, because I think I'm not super old, but I've lived enough life. One of the sayings that always used to Christian platitudes that used to rub me raw all the time was just, well, there's no perfect church, and if there is, don't join it, because then you'll ruin it.
It's kind of an anarchical vision.
Right. Yes.
If you hear about it, don't dare touch it, because you'll contaminate it.
Right. But I mean, the sentiment behind it is true, I think, is that all churches have their faults. And so how the Orthodox are going to play out in America is interesting. And I know that because I know that most of the people that go to it are, like, that's what's funny. I don't know if I spoke with you about this, but most of the people that go to the Orthodox Church, even though they're kind of within their own little subcultures, like the church that I am is heavily Russian, Slavic kind of.
Right.
And so those little cultures have been maintained with their own uniqueness to a little degree, but they're also very American. So, I mean, individualism, autonomy, the same kind of rationalistic thinking that I'm talking about, that's their elephant just as much as me. So even if in the official theology and thinking and history of the church, the thing that doesn't trigger me isn't there, it's still going to be there with the bulk of the people.
Yeah.
And so how that's going to affect the church, I don't know. I mean,
that's really
I don't know.
Question.
Yeah, it is. And I don't know. I mean, the Orthodox Church, like you've said this before, they're never going to become super popular, because there's nothing sexy about it, really. I mean, it's it's a slog and it's really uncomfortable. Like if you're, I mean, it probably, I say all this, it depends on your temperament, I suppose. Like I'm finding it really freeing and great in a lot of ways. It doesn't bother me at all, but that's also because I'm very comfortable with being uncomfortable. You know, I almost feel most comfortable with that because I'm just a weirdo that way. This is why my categories and your labels and you're trying to figure me out where I come from, it's probably hard. I was saying this to Julian is because Julian was telling me I don't I don't think he'd mind, but he was saying he doesn't, like when he comes across something where he's wrong about something, like that's uncomfortable to him. And I said, like, I eat that up. Like when I find out I've been wrong about something, like I love it. It excites me. I get pumped because I truly believe the thing that Jordan Peterson's talking about that's a greater chance to align with the true, good, and the beautiful. You know, when I see error as a chance to improve and grow. So I don't know.
One of the interesting things is that when I listen to you talk in this way, I also hear resonance with a lot of contemporary American culture.
Okay.
And again, in terms of the, millennials don't want to be categorized, don't put me in a box. I mean, there's definitely that spirit in the culture too.
Sure.
And so it's interesting, so now, and I know something about immigrant churches because of course the CRC is an immigrant church a few generations back. And so you as a non-immigrant coming in, you can see probably better than many of the Russians how quickly American they are becoming. And it's a much more intrusive culture than it was for the Dutchmen before World War II. But it's also interesting how this great empty frontier of options and freedom leads Americans back into, gosh, everything is just so open. I really want an enclosure.
Yeah.
I love the beginning, the Book of Pi. The beginning of that book talks about lions and, we go to the zoo and we look at the lion in the cage that's got free healthcare and $3 a day. And we look at the lion and we think, oh, it's not the noble lion out in the Serengeti. Yeah. And the author of the books makes the point, well, let's take a human being and throw them out in the Serengeti and see how happy they are. Yeah. They can answer a questionnaire. and so a big part of American culture, I think about Rebel Wisdom did a video with Jordan Greenhall and I think that's his name, and Akira the Don. And there's a cool part in this video where Akira the Don says, being faithful to your wife and raising your family is the new radical. And the reason is because, Madonna can only get so naked. And this progressivism that keeps wanting to, okay, so Nadia Bolz-Weber, the church is always a little behind, okay, so, the new church rule for our new cool church is that anything goes except for kids and animals. But I was watching, I mentioned that I had a similar conversation with Preston Sprinkle on the podcast. So I was watching the Netflix Umbrella Academy. And of course,
I've been watching that.
Yeah. So of course it's like, okay, who's going to be the gay character? Because you got to have a gay character because you got to represent. So, okay, there's the gay character.
Happened. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So there's the gay character, but then you've got the sexual tension between a couple of the adopted siblings. Mm-hmm. And so then it's, and so the thing about progressivism is you're always looking for where the line is. And how do you know where the line is? You're looking for that which is forbidden. So now we're at Philip Reif and his, Rod Dreher is the one who introduced me to Philip Reif. And so you can always track the culture by that which is forbidden. So now, no dogs or no animals, no kids, but what about siblings? Ooh, there's the new gray line. you know?
Yeah.
And so at some point, because we're not dumb, we're always thinking, okay, well, what is the game? What is the game? Well, then we figure out, well, the game is always just transcending the next line. So then you flip all the way back with Akira the Don and say, well, now the game is living within the lines.
Yeah. Yeah, that reminds me of I think you've seen this or you told people to watch or you talked about it, but who was that? There's alliteration, MM with the bug. What is that one? Do you remember what I'm talking about? Mole bug?
Oh,
something?
yeah, Mencius mole bug that I got
Mencius
from
mole
the distributist.
So I watched that, and what is interesting, so this is an idea I'd love to talk to you about, and I think it relates to all this stuff. The Adam did, Esther debate, even this progressivism and those lines and how do those lines work. But in that, it was funny. I mean, it's a powerful graphic when they're laying up like the conservative from 1500s to the conservative from 50 years after that, to the conservative after that and after that. And you realize it keeps going up. So like up here, Ben Shapiro, the conservative of today, compare him to the conservative in the early church. They would have, freaked out.
That's right. Ben's an observant Jew, but he's not Hasidic.
Right. Well, and even within, say you don't even go outside of any specific tradition, within every tradition that's happening. And so, this gets into, eschatology and different debates somewhat within the Christian frame. But then are you familiar, or have you ever heard of spiral dynamics?
Yep. The integral people talk about the spiral.
Yeah. So, I think it's a powerful tool to see things. And essentially the spiral dynamics is just like if you think of a DNA helix or something, it's just the circle, but it's going around and around and ascending. And depending on your frame of reference, it can look like the Nietzschean circle that's just like it goes back and loops on itself. But there's slight degrees of...
Now it's three-dimensional.
You're right. But there's slight degrees of progress or evolution or however you want to look at it. And when you do look at history, I think on a really big time frame, almost no matter what metric you use, it seems like there is a progression, a positive progression to some degree. And so, and then how that relates to laws and differences. This gets into the whole debate, which I think falls flat in a rationalist frame, is of like Old Testament laws. And then you put it in these categories. Well, that's Mosaic law. And then this is this law. And that's okay. No one cares and no one's buying it. But like, is there some kind of some people buy it, but that's where I would say, I don't think you really buy it. You just want to buy it. Because this is where I maybe tweeted a while back, you maybe saw this, but I think, not to derail this, but I think sometimes I find that intellectual atheists or agnostics, I think, are almost intellectually closer to an authentic Christianity than sometimes rationalist fundamentalist Christians.
How so?
Well, and a lot of people...
I'm not disagreeing, but I want to know what specifically you're thinking about in that.
I think they can be, not all of them, but some of them can be submitted to the truth that's outside of the truth they currently apprehend. And so with it, they maybe came from a narrow tradition. Like I've heard a lot of people say, Tim Keller says this, Rob Bell says this, tell me the God you don't believe in, and I probably don't believe in him either. But when you come from a really narrow frame, religion binds and blinds, like this is what God is. Anything else, it's not God. And I think there's authentic, honest atheists and agnostics that say like, that's ridiculous. And that God's a joke. And I don't believe in that God.
Yeah.
I'm on their team, and I think they're closer to an authentic relationship with God than the fundamentalist intellectually. How that actually plays out in their life of virtue, whatever, that's a different story. Because I think there are some fundamentalists that are beautiful people. I just think intellectually it's bankrupt. You know, like I've heard Mike McHargue, Science Mike, I don't know, he's a very progressivist Christian. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's one half of the podcast. I don't know if they're still doing it, The Liturgists, but
Oh, yeah, yeah.
He triggers me because he's a progressivist rationalist, and he just drives me crazy. But he would say that a lot of coming out of his deconstruction where he's at, but his fundamentalist kind of upbringing. He says that all the time. There was really beautiful people within that church and people that he still loves dearly. But then what's funny to me is on Twitter, he seems to forget that when he's ranting about politics. Like it's just, I don't know.
Politics is the great tempter. It's the horror of Babylon, and
yes.
And Trump just raised the stakes, baby. We got Trump derangement system on, you know, the left is Trump deranged, and the right is, well, the right doesn't quite know what it wants to do with Trump either. Some days, some of the right does, others of it doesn't. But yeah. Well, politics is where, in a sense, politics is where your religion has to meet your pragmatism, and
yeah.
because again, that's getting back to you're losing your free will as you get down to the moment of your decision. So your politics was baked before you get to the voting booth.
Yeah. And I think that's largely what, you know, hate means when he's saying in the righteous mind is it's mainly temperament. Like it's not determined, but you're not free in regard to it. Like, and we have to realize that in these discussions, or else we're just going to keep blaming people for things they don't have any control over.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Well, it's complicated. Well, this has been this has kind of gone how I thought it would. It's not a bad thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing at all. But just you know, again, trying to, when you meet somebody, you try to figure out who and what they are, and you know, I can't put a label on you, but this is who you are.
I don't know. Yeah, so before we end, that would be I want to hear, I always love these questions, but how would you describe me? And feel free. So your whole conversation with Lucy, I know you're somewhat of the negative. You're not a people pleaser, but I assume you're probably like a 9 on the Enneagram. You're very agreeable. Like you're not going to offend me at all. I would be very interested to hear how I come across and how I'm perceived by you, because neither of us think our opinion is the monarchical vision. So let's have it.
Well, some of what I said in terms of, I see you, I mean, again, my resolution of you is necessarily low because, you know, a couple of online conversations and a bunch of tweets. But I do see you in the light of many in your generation who grew up in an evangelical situation. And see, it was very interesting when I was talking to Ron Dart, and you really enjoyed that conversation.
Telling?
And you know, Ron was making the kinds of noises. And again, I didn't check him. And then people get nervous because, well, Paul, why isn't Paul checking them? So then who is Paul? You know, and when I'm doing an interview like that, my goal isn't to correct the person I'm interviewing, but to ideally, you know, present with as much clarity. I'll push back on some things sometimes, but more in terms of trying to understand what the person I'm talking to is saying. Okay.
Right.
And so when Ron Dart is making his comments about evangelicalism and evangelical appropriation of C.S. Lewis, Ron Dart has a real point there, because a lot of evangelicals embrace Lewis with both arms, and many have written about this before. There's a lot to Lewis that is not very evangelical.
Yeah, for sure.
His lifestyle, I mean, he wasn't an alcoholic, but he loved to smoke, he loved to drink, his situation with Joy Davidman, again, from the bio I read, it's like, wow. He kind of tricked a priest into marrying them in the church to break the rules. That was not above board. And, that was just wrong what Lewis did to that poor priest. It wasn't right.
Yeah.
And so Lewis is a complicated man. And Lewis's relationship, I mean, Emmett in the last battle with, is he, it's not full-blown MacDonald universalism, but it's not closed door evangelical.
Yeah. It's an Achilles heel. It's an Achilles heel of their embrace of him.
So, you to me strike me as someone who is working through all of those kinds of issues. And so it doesn't, Molly Worthen wrote a really nice book on evangelicalism, the history of neo-evangelicalism. Let me look it up. I read it a few years ago. What was it called? Apostles of Reason. Boy, that'll hit you. Apostles of Reason, the Crisis of Authority in American Evangelicalism. And one of the things that she wrote was previous waves of evangelicals have become enamored with the Orthodox for many of the reasons that I hear from you.
Mm-hmm.
And so I see you in that light. And whereas you might see yourself as, of course, my view of you is much more low resolution than you of yourself, obviously. You've known yourself for all your life, and I've just known you for a little bit. But I do see you in a sense, because I have to somehow integrate you into my map.
You're right.
I do see you as these evangelicals, these people who are raised evangelical, and some of the built-in inconsistencies with evangelicalism and narrownesses. Now I'm sounding like Ron Dart, but I agree with him with some of this.
Yeah. You
had to break out. And so one of the things I said, if you go back and listen to my conversation with Father David, one of the things I noted about him, I said, both you and Peugeot grew up evangelical.
Mm-hmm.
And you bit hard onto Jordan Peterson.
Mm-hmm.
I dare bet the Russians in your church, they wouldn't have any fascination for Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And so then talking to Father David about that, I mean, the people in his church, it's kind of like the people in my church. Jordan Peterson, they don't know. Paul's making videos, strangers show up.
Right.
People send the church money. It's all good. What Paul does with a lot of Paul's time, we trust him. I'm sure he's doing kingdom work, but they're not going to watch my videos.
Right.
So I see this bigger trend of people like you dealing with many of the same kinds of issues. So I talked to Preston yesterday, and I think we might do another conversation. I should interview him for my channel next.
Yeah.
And Preston too, I said, I'm trying to figure out what you do. Are you like a celebrity evangelical? He's kind of like, oh, but
he's B-list. Sorry, Preston.
Oh.
Well, I mean, he's not. No, Preston's very well known out there, and he's an awesome. I mean, I obviously love him to the nth degree, but I mean, he's not like as famous as Tim Keller.
No. But he's also in some ways like you in that he's kind of a misfit.
Oh yeah.
And he, he's trying to figure me out, and he says, well, he sounds like you're kind of a misfit in the CRC, and in some ways I am.
Yeah.
Partly because Northside, where I grew up, was very different from most people's CRC's experience. But I went to Eastern Christian. That's very similar to people's CRC experience. I did mission work. Now I'm out here in California. So in some ways I'm a misfit, but in other ways I feel zero desire to leave my tribe. Well, maybe part of that is because I don't think my preacher is an idiot, or at least he's an idiot I love, being me.
Right.
And most, the other pastors I've had in my life were my father and Dave Beelan at Madison Square in Grand Rapids, Michigan, who's another man that I deeply respect and deeply love. So those are the only CRC ministers I've ever had. So,
Yeah.
um,
Right.
but I see you as very much on a journey, and the contours of your journey are reasonable and understandable to me, given all of the stuff built into American evangelicalism and the other things on the menu. And I thought, so actually, Molly Worthen's book, you would probably find interesting, because it
Yeah.
maps out this history of neo-evangelicalism and all of the crises kind of baked into that get expressed in the fracturing of the one way is fracturing, another way is diversity of the American
Yeah.
evangelical scene. And increasingly the Orthodox are I know if you're Orthodox that might just really rub you the wrong way, but once you come to America, you become a piece of it. And
Yeah.
once you start saying, we're going to take the likes of Luke and welcome into our church and have him become a part of our body, and the likes of Father David, who, grew up evangelical, went PCA, for a while was in the CRC in South Bend with my friend Lan Vandezee, and now in the Orthodox.
Yeah.
The Orthodox is going to be open to people like you and Father David and Jonathan Peugeot. The Orthodox are going to be dealing with evangelicalism, but they're going to deal with it in their own special way, just like the CRC has. So that's kind of where I map you onto my map of American Christianity.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I want to just add this on the end, if I may, quick. I think a lot of this, I think through my own evolution, I've come to really understand that this is really, to me, this is really it's a strictly intellectual thing. So like back to my whole belief and relationship to time, I really see it as a problem within Western Christianity and its worst, probably, or most obvious manifestation in evangelicalism. And I think my goal for forever was to not leave. I didn't want to leave the evangelical church. In ways I still don't. But I just found that there wasn't ever, like, if I were at your church, I probably wouldn't have ever left. I mean, I'm serious.
Oh boy. A lot of people left my church.
Well, I know. And for whatever reasons, but you, the thing that I saw as the problem, I don't think that you have. And so it was more at like the higher levels, because like Jonathan Peugeot has said, or Ron Dart was saying in that C.S. Lewis thing, you have to be able to rub shoulders with people that aren't intellects, that don't care about this stuff. I mean, like, my father's this way. I talk to my dad about things, or me and my mom will get together and start talking about theology, and my dad, he'll just sit there and he's like, I don't understand a word you just said. But what's great is like but there are people, I've known many people like that who couldn't talk about theology at all, but are incredibly godly people. Right. So like, I don't think you need to understand this stuff in order to be holy. However, I see it as a systemic spiritual principality kind of problem underneath the whole thing, that I really think most of the pastors and intellects within that system don't see, and they aren't addressing. So they keep saying, like, why do we have atheism? Why do we have all these people leaving? Why do our kids grow up and go to college and then leave the church? I know why. Like, I think I know why.
Yeah.
But I don't think you want to hear why.
Yeah.
And that's kind of that was eventually my big frustration, is there's not, at least yet, there's not a culture or a tool to be able to bridge that gap of the thing that everybody within that culture has decided not to see.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm hoping Jordan Peterson is, honestly, what you are. Like, this is why I turn everybody on to you, because I'm just like, I told Preston this before too. I'm like, you're a gateway drug for people. I mean, that's a negative way to say it, but it's
that's what evangelists want to be.
Open your mind.
Evangelists want to, the point of an evangelist is not, I want you to be a disciple of Paul Vanderklay.
Sure.
The point of an evangelist is, I want you to be a disciple of Jesus Christ.
Follow me as I follow Christ.
That's right. And if I'm helpful to you, that's exactly my goal. but I am not important in this, because
Right.
I am not your savior. And if you have me as my savior, as your savior, poor you, because I'm not even a good
Yeah.
savior for me. So,
Right. Hey, next time let's talk about Jordan Peterson's soteriology.
oh yeah, yeah.
I
Well,
I
so
have
Preston
lots
and
of
I
thoughts.
talked about that. Preston said,
I know.
he's
Yeah.
got a he's got a Augustinian anthropology. I said, yeah. And he said he's got a Pelagian soteriology. I said, yeah.
See, I don't. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think so. He's got a theosis.
Well, that's definitely what we should talk about. Well, I don't know that it's, well, see again, it's unfair to talk about Jordan Peterson as Pelagian, because that's not
Yes,
really his frame.
you're right.
But at
Yep.
the same time, there is a similar. Jordan Peterson does not have, because of his metaphysic again, he's not a fully Catholic, not a fully classical theist
Right.
metaphysic. He's going to have trouble with, Jesus as savior. Now, maybe you can try to embody the archetype of Jesus and in that way be saved. See, and that's not unchristian.
Right.
That's the difficulty, because, and
That gets into all those words that fudge. Savior, union with Christ. What do you mean by that? Ask people in different Christian traditions.
no, that's right. That's right. And there are, I could throw a bunch of books written in the last 5 years that continue to, it continues to get at this question of soteriology, because here's and again, it's all right there in the sacramental aspect,
Yeah.
because when Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me, that cross becomes sacramental that you take up, and you are joined with Christ. And as Paul says, you are, in your body, you are making up for, the mysterious passage.
What's lacking in Christ's afflictions?
What's lacking in Christ's afflictions?
Fit that into your systematic theology.
Well, I'm a Protestant. I've got my systematics is always tested by the Bible. And so,
Theoretically.
I'm a confessionalist, Christian Reformed pastor, but part of that confession is we keep going back to the Bible to recalibrate and refine, and we do that in community. And so
Semper reformanda, huh?
that's right. Because the problem is, gosh,
Yeah. We'll have to save it for next time. I keep baiting you. I'll throw things out and bait you.
Oh my, get me kicked out of the ministry. Not really.
Well,
All right,
hey,
Luke, this has been wonderful.
thank you. It was fun.
Thanks for taking the time.
Yep. We'll talk to you later, buddy.
All right. Bye-bye.